A teenager walks out of his home on a summer morning in 1997. He's 17 years old, standing 6 feet 1 inch tall, wearing a white t-shirt and jeans. A small gold earring catches the Texas sunlight in his right ear. He leaves, and then nothing. For 27 years, Stephen Shawn Austin existed in that terrible liminal space reserved for the missing, neither confirmed alive nor confirmed dead. His mother filed a police report. His face appeared on missing persons databases. But Stephen had vanished as completely as smoke in the desert wind. What happened in the 1,300 miles between El Paso, Texas, and Madison County, Mississippi? How does a 17-year-old boy disappear from the western edge of Texas and end up dead in the Deep South? And perhaps most haunting of all, why did it take nearly 3 decades for anyone to know? This is the story of Stephen Shawn Austin. But it's also the story of every missing person who becomes a case number instead of a name. Every unidentified body that waits in silence for someone to call them home. Every family that lives in the purgatory of not knowing. Because sometimes, the most tragic part of a tragedy isn't the crime itself. It's how easily someone can disappear and how long they can stay gone. Let that sink in for a moment. Stephen Shawn Austin was born on September 22, 1979, in the late summer when the desert heat still clung to West Texas like a second skin. He came into a world that was changing rapidly, the tail end of the 70s giving way to a new decade of uncertainty and possibility. By 1997, Stephen was 17 years old, on the cusp of adulthood, but not quite there yet. He was a tall young man, 6'1", but slender, weighing only about 140 pounds. He had black hair and brown eyes, smooth, dark skin that marked him as African American in a city where the population was predominantly Hispanic. Those who remember him from the sparse records that remain noted distinguishing features: scars on both sides of his neck, a scar on his nose, and that gold earring he wore in his right ear. But Stephen was more than a physical description on a missing persons report. He was more than height and weight and identifying marks. He was a 17-year-old with dreams, fears, and a future that should have stretched out before him for decades. According to medical records, Stephen dealt with several health challenges. He had heart problems and sinus issues. He suffered from asthma, not uncommon in the dry, dusty climate of El Paso, where the desert air could be harsh on the lungs, especially in the summer months when dust storms rolled in from the Chihuahuan Desert. These weren't conditions that would prevent him from living a normal teenage life, but they were part of who he was, part of what made him Stephen. They required medication, possibly regular doctor visits, and attention to his physical well-being. He lived with his mother in the 9500 block of Sims Street in El Paso, Texas. Sims Street runs through an area of El Paso that, in 1997, was a working-class neighborhood where families did their best to get by. It wasn't the wealthiest part of town, wasn't the place where kids drove brand-new cars or wore designer clothes, but it was home. The houses were modest, the streets lined with desert-adapted landscaping, and neighbors knew each other's business, for better or worse. El Paso itself is a unique city. Sitting at the westernmost tip of Texas, right on the border with Mexico and New Mexico, it's a place where cultures collide and blend. The Rio Grande runs through it, separating it from Ciudad Juarez, its Mexican sister city. In 1997, El Paso had a population of around 600,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in Texas. But despite its size, it often felt like a small town, especially in neighborhoods like the one where Stephen lived. Like many teenagers, Stephen had encountered some trouble with the law. The records indicate he was on juvenile probation in August of 1997. We don't know the specific charges or circumstances. Juvenile records are sealed, and the details have never been made public. What we do know is that Stephen had recently arrived in El Paso to live with his mother, and he'd met with his probation officer for the first time just one day before he disappeared. Some people might judge a 17-year-old for being in the juvenile justice system, but here's the truth. Teenagers make mistakes. They test boundaries. They struggle with circumstances beyond their control. And in 1997, the juvenile justice system, particularly for young black men like Stephen in a city where they were a minority, wasn't always designed to rehabilitate. Sometimes it felt more like a pipeline to something worse. One detail in the reports suggests that Stephen may have had previous legal troubles before coming to El Paso, before moving in with his mother in El Paso. This raises questions. Where had Stephen been before? Was he living with other family members? Had he been in foster care? Had something happened that necessitated this move to his mother's home in El Paso? These questions remain unanswered. Stephen also went by Steve to friends and family. That nickname speaks to something intimate, something personal. Stephen was the name on official documents, on his birth certificate, on the missing persons report. But Steve was who he was, to the people who knew him, who cared about him, who called out to him when they saw him on the street. And here's what haunts me most as I research this case. We should know more. We should know what music Stephen liked. Was he into the hip-hop that dominated the late 90s? Tupac and Biggie, Master P and Wu-Tang Clan? Or did he prefer R&B, the smooth sounds of Boyz II Men or Usher? We should know whether he played basketball in the neighborhood courts, whether he had a girlfriend, whether he was good at math or English or shop class. We should know what made him laugh, what worried him at night, what he hoped for when he thought about turning 18, about becoming an adult. But the records are silent on these things. And that silence, that's part of the tragedy we're going to explore. Because when Stephen disappeared, he didn't just disappear physically. He became invisible in another way. Another young black man who slipped through the cracks of a system that wasn't designed to hold on to people like him. Another face on a missing persons database that people scrolled past without really seeing. August 19th, 1997. It was a Tuesday in the height of summer. In El Paso, that means temperatures climbing into the mid-90s, maybe pushing towards 100 degrees. The sun beats down with an intensity that makes the air shimmer over the asphalt. It's the kind of heat that you move slowly, seek shade, dream of air conditioning. The kind of heat where even the lizards look for cover. For most El Paso teenagers in August, it meant the last sweet days of summer vacation. School was about to start again, or had just started depending on the district. The freedom of summer was running out like sand through an hourglass. Soon it would be back to classrooms and homework and structure. But for 17-year-old Stephen Austin, August 19th would be different. It would be the last day anyone can confirm seeing him. Here's where the case becomes immediately frustrating. We have conflicting information about Stephen's last known movements. According to some reports, Stephen was last seen leaving his family's residence during the morning hours of August 19th, heading to school. But other reports state something different. That Stephen was last seen at his home at 11 p.m. that same day, nearly 14 hours later. Think about that discrepancy for a moment. Was Stephen last seen in the morning or at night? Was he leaving for school or staying home? This isn't a minor detail. It's fundamental to understanding what happened. It's the difference between Stephen disappearing in broad daylight while going about his normal routine and Stephen disappearing late at night when the streets are emptier and darker. This kind of conflicting information plagues missing persons cases, especially cases that go cold. Memories fade, initial reports get confused. Maybe Stephen's mother told police she saw him leave in the morning. Maybe a neighbor reported seeing him later that night. Maybe there's confusion about whether August 19th was truly the last day anyone saw him, or if it was just the day he was reported missing. Details that seemed clear at the time become muddy years later. And when you're trying to solve a mystery 27 years after the fact, these contradictions can become insurmountable obstacles. What we can say with certainty, August 19th, 1997, is the date Stephen Austin was reported missing from El Paso, Texas. At some point on that day, morning or night, we can't be entirely sure, Stephen was there at his home on Sims Street. And then he wasn't. Let me paint you a picture of what that day might have looked like, based on what we know about El Paso in August and the life of a 17-year-old on probation.
He might have woken up in the small bedroom he likely shared in his mother's house. Maybe he got up when she called him, or maybe he slept in, the way teenagers do. He would have gotten dressed, pulling on that white t-shirt, the dark pants or jeans, lacing up his white tennis shoes. Maybe he ate breakfast. Maybe he didn't. 17-year-old boys aren't always big on breakfast. His mother might have reminded him about something. Be safe. Be good. Be back by a certain time. The kinds of things mothers say, especially to sons who've had trouble with the law. The kinds of things that become unbearably precious when someone doesn't come home. Stephen would have walked out into the El Paso morning already warm, even at 8 or 9 a.m. If he was heading to school, he might have walked, or caught a ride with someone, or taken a bus. The 9500 block of Sims isn't far from several schools. Bowie High School is in the general area, as are several middle schools if he needed to make up credits. Did he meet up with friends along the way? Did he stop at a convenience store for a soda or a snack? Did anyone see him and remember seeing him? The morning passes. By noon, the heat is oppressive. By 3 p.m., if Stephen was at school, classes would be letting out. And somewhere between that moment and the time his mother expected him home, Stephen disappeared. If Stephen was last seen at 11 p.m., that changes everything. That means Stephen made it through the entire day. Maybe he did go to school, or maybe he stayed home. Maybe he hung out with friends in the neighborhood, shooting hoops or just talking trash, the way teenage boys do. Maybe he walked to a nearby store. Maybe he visited that cousin who Detective Amon later mentioned. As the sun set around 8 p.m., the temperature would have finally started to drop. Night in the desert brings relief from the heat. The streets take on a different character after dark, quieter in residential areas, but with pockets of activity around convenience stores, parks, parking lots where teenagers congregate. If Stephen was home at 11 p.m., who saw him there? His mother? A sibling? A friend? And if he left after that, why? Where would a 17-year-old be going at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday night? Did someone call him? Did someone pick him up? Did he sneak out for reasons we can only guess at? According to Detective Michael Amon of the El Paso Police Department, who would later work the cold case, there's an important detail in the timeline. Stephen had met with his probation officer for the first time just one day before his disappearance. On August 18th, a Monday, he had that initial meeting. On August 19th, a Tuesday, he was gone. Detective Amon would later theorize in a 2014 interview with KTSM News the fact that he disappeared the day after the meeting, the initial meeting with that officer. He probably didn't want to be in the juvenile probation system. This theory suggests that Stephen might have run away, that he might have decided that facing probation was too much and that disappearing was preferable. It's a theory that makes a certain kind of sense. Teenagers do run away. They do make impulsive decisions when they feel cornered or scared or like the walls are closing in. Probation can feel overwhelming, especially that first meeting. There are rules, curfews, check-ins, drug tests possibly, community service requirements, restrictions on who you can associate with. For a 17-year-old who may have already felt like he had no control over his life, these new restrictions might have felt unbearable. Maybe Stephen walked out of that probation meeting on August 18th feeling trapped. Maybe he spent that night thinking about his options. Maybe on August 19th, he made a decision to leave. But here's the problem with the runaway theory, a significant problem. Stephen Austin didn't just disappear from El Paso and start a new life somewhere else. His remains would eventually be found over 1,300 miles away in Madison, Mississippi. And the investigation into his death is still ongoing, which suggests that whatever happened to this 17-year-old boy wasn't as simple as running away. So let's return to the facts we have. What Stephen was wearing. According to the missing persons report filed by his mother, Stephen was dressed in a white t-shirt, dark blue or brown pants or jeans, white tennis shoes, and that round gold earring in his right ear. It's the kind of outfit any teenager might wear on a summer day. Comfortable, practical, unremarkable. Not the kind of outfit you'd choose if you were planning to run away and start a new life. No jacket, no extra layers, nothing to suggest he was planning to be gone for long. What we don't know: did Stephen have money in his pockets? Even if it was just a few dollars, that would tell us something. Did he carry identification, a school ID, a state ID? Did he take anything with him? A backpack, personal items, clothes, medication for his asthma or heart condition? The reports don't say. These details, which might have been crucial to understanding whether Stephen left voluntarily or was taken, have been lost to time or were never properly documented. His state of mind. Was Stephen worried about probation? Was he scared, angry, resigned? Did he talk to friends about what was on his mind? Did he make any phone calls that day? Did he seem different to anyone who saw him? We don't know. The absence of evidence. One thing that stands out in this case is what's not there. There's no evidence of a struggle at the house on Sim Street. There's no evidence that Stephen was planning to leave. No missing clothes, no empty drawers, no goodbye notes. There's no evidence that he was meeting someone specific, though that doesn't mean that he wasn't. What we do know is this: at some point on August 19, 1997, Stephen Shawn Austin ceased to be present in El Paso, Texas. Whether he walked away voluntarily, was driven away by someone he knew, or was taken by force, we cannot say with certainty. And whatever happened next would set in motion a mystery that wouldn't be solved for 27 years. Stephen's mother filed a missing persons report with the El Paso Police Department. The exact timing of this report, whether it was filed on August 19th itself when Stephen didn't come home, or the next day or several days later, isn't clear from the available records. But we know that she did file a report. She did try to find her son. Think about that moment. Think about being a mother and realizing your 17-year-old son hasn't come home. At first, maybe you're annoyed. Teenagers are irresponsible sometimes. They lose track of time. They hang out with friends and forget to call. Then you're worried. You start calling his friends, if you have their numbers. You call relatives. You drive around the neighborhood looking for him. You check the places he usually goes. Then you're terrified, because hours have turned into a day, and your son, your baby, no matter how tall he's gotten, is out there somewhere, and you don't know where. And then you call the police. In 1997, the response to missing teenagers, particularly minority teenagers, particularly teenagers with criminal records, was complicated. There was often a waiting period, an unofficial but widely practiced policy that you had to wait 24 or 48 hours before filing a missing persons report, based on the assumption that most people who go missing return on their own. This particularly affected teenagers, who were often assumed to be runaways. When Stephen's mother reported him missing, the police would have taken basic information. What was he wearing? When was he last seen? Does he have any medical conditions? Any reason he might run away? Any friends or relatives he might be staying with? They would have created a case file, case number 97-26-114, according to records. They would have entered Stephen's information into the National Crime Information System, or NCIS, a national database of missing persons and wanted criminals. But here's the harsh reality. In 1997, thousands of people were reported missing in Texas alone. Police departments were understaffed and overwhelmed, and cases involving teenagers, particularly teenagers on probation, often weren't treated with the same urgency as cases involving young children or adults who disappeared under obviously suspicious circumstances. There's no evidence that El Paso police conducted extensive searches for Stephen, no reports of search parties combing the desert, no bloodhounds tracking his scent, no helicopters with thermal imaging cameras scanning the landscape.
A human being, reduced to bones, lying in the Mississippi earth. No name, no family coming to claim them, no funeral, no grave with a headstone bearing their name. When the remains were finally discovered and brought to the Mississippi State Medical Examiner's Office in 2018, the first step was basic anthropological analysis. The forensic anthropologist would examine the bones to determine sex, the shape of the pelvis, the robustness of the skull, and other skeletal features can indicate biological sex with reasonable accuracy. Age, the development of bones, the fusion of growth plates, and tooth development can help estimate age at death. Ancestry, certain skull measurements and features can suggest racial background, though this is less precise than many people realize. Height, the length of long bones like the femur can be used to calculate approximate height. Any distinguishing features, old injuries, dental work, anomalies in bone development. The analysis determined that these were the remains of a black male, approximately 15 to 24 years old at the time of death. That age range is crucial, 15 to 24. Stephen Austin was 17 when he disappeared in 1997. He would have been in his late 30s by 2018. So if these remains were Stephen's, he died when he was young, likely soon after his disappearance, not decades later. The remains were entered into the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, NAMIS, as case UP 132686. This database, launched in 2007, is designed to help match missing persons with unidentified remains. It's a vital tool, but it requires that missing persons reports and unidentified remains be accurately entered and regularly compared. For years, UP 132686 sat in the database, a Jane Doe or John Doe waiting for a name. The remains existed in that terrible limbo between person and evidence, between past and present. And somewhere in Texas, Stephen Austin's missing persons case also sat in databases, waiting for resolution. But these two cases, missing person 1827-DMTX and unidentified remains UP 132686, weren't connected. Not yet. Why did it take from 2018 to 2024, 6 years, to identify these remains as Stephen Austin? The answer lies in the limitations of traditional identification methods. Dental records. One common way to identify remains is by comparing dental records, but this requires that the missing person had dental records on file, that those records were preserved and accessible, and that the unidentified remains had sufficient dental evidence for comparison. We don't know if Stephen had comprehensive dental records from 1997, or if the remains found in Mississippi had enough dental evidence for comparison. Fingerprints, these can't be obtained from skeletal remains. DNA. Traditional DNA testing requires a reference sample, DNA from the missing person, from a hairbrush, toothbrush, etc., or DNA from close relatives. In 2018, perhaps law enforcement didn't have access to reference samples for Stephen,
or the DNA from the remains was too degraded for traditional testing methods. Database matching. Even with modern databases, matches aren't automatic. Someone has to actively search for potential matches, comparing characteristics of missing persons with characteristics of unidentified remains. With thousands of cases in the system, this is a monumental task. So UP132686 remained unidentified, and Stephen Austin remained missing, and his mother continued not knowing what had happened to her son. Until 2024, when advanced technology and a special initiative changed everything. On May 23, 2024, National Missing Children's Day, a company called Othram announced something unprecedented: Project 525. The goal was audacious: to identify 525 unidentified juvenile remains using advanced DNA technology. The number 525 wasn't random, it was deliberately chosen to align with 525, May 25th, National Missing Children's Day. This was a massive undertaking. Across the United States, there are hundreds of unidentified children and teenagers in medical examiners' offices, in databases, in unmarked graves. These are the most vulnerable victims. Young people who died far from home, or whose families never reported them missing, or whose cases fell through the cracks of an overwhelmed system. Othram is a private DNA laboratory based in the Woodlands, Texas, ironically not far from El Paso where Stephen once lived. They specialize in forensic-grade genome sequencing, a technique that can extract and analyze DNA from samples that traditional methods can't handle: degraded remains, old evidence, tiny amounts of genetic material. But advanced DNA testing is expensive. It can cost $5,000 to $10,000 or more per case. That's why Project 525 relied on philanthropy and crowdfunding. People who cared about giving names back to the nameless could donate to fund these identifications. For the Mississippi John Doe, UP132686, the funding came from Carla Davis, a Mississippi native and philanthropist who wanted to help bring closure to families. In June 2024, the Mississippi State Medical Examiner's Office sent evidence from UP132686 to Othram's laboratory. What happened next was a marvel of modern science. First, Othram scientists had to extract DNA from the remains. After being in the ground for years, potentially decades, DNA degrades. It breaks into smaller and smaller fragments. Environmental factors, moisture, temperature fluctuations, bacteria, all damage genetic material. But Othram's technology, called forensic-grade genome sequencing, can work with incredibly small amounts of degraded DNA. They use massive parallel sequencing, essentially reading millions of DNA fragments simultaneously and then computationally piecing them together like a jigsaw puzzle. Once they had a DNA profile for the unidentified person, the next step was genealogical research. This is the technique that has revolutionized cold case investigations in recent years. You might have heard about it in relation to the Golden State Killer case or other high-profile cases where DNA led investigators to suspects decades after crimes were committed. Here's how it works. The DNA profile from the unidentified remains is uploaded to genetic genealogy databases, places where people have uploaded their own DNA results from companies like 23andMe or Ancestry.com to find relatives and build family trees. When you upload your DNA, these databases search for matches, people who share segments of DNA with you, indicating you have a common ancestor. Close relatives share a lot of DNA. More distant relatives share less. For the Mississippi John Doe, Othram's forensic genetic genealogy team searched for relatives. They found matches, people who shared enough DNA with the unidentified person to suggest they had common ancestors. Then comes the painstaking work of genealogical research. The team builds family trees, going back generations to find where the lines connect. They research birth records, death records, census data, obituaries. They look for people in these family trees who went missing and fit the profile of the unidentified remains. This process can take weeks or months. It requires expertise in both genetics and genealogy. It requires access to records and databases. It requires patience and persistence. But eventually, a name emerged from the data: Stephen Shawn Austin. Finding a name through genealogical genetics is just the first step. It has to be confirmed. Investigators used the genealogical research to identify a potential relative of Stephen, someone still living who was likely a close family member. With this person's cooperation, they obtained a DNA sample. Then came the comparison using a technique called kin-SNP rapid relationship testing. This specialized test analyzes specific genetic markers that are particularly useful for determining family relationships. It can tell you with high certainty whether two people are parent and child, siblings, or other close relatives. The results came back positive. The DNA from the potential relative matched the DNA from the Mississippi remains in a pattern consistent with them being related.
The Mississippi John Doe, UP 132686, the remains that had lain unidentified for years, was Stephen Shawn Austin, born September 22, 1979. The 17-year-old boy, who disappeared from El Paso, Texas on August 19, 1997, had been found. Imagine being Stephen's mother and receiving that call. For 27 years she had wondered. For 27 years she had hoped he might walk through the door one day, tall and healthy, and apologizing for being gone so long. Or she had feared the worst, imagining all the terrible things that could have happened. And then, in late 2024, the call came. Her son had been found, but not alive. He had been dead, possibly since shortly after he disappeared. He had been in Mississippi, far from home, unidentified and alone. Relief and devastation. Answers and more questions. An ending, but not closure. Not really. Because knowing he's dead doesn't tell you how he died, or why, or who might be responsible. On December 20, 2024, Othram announced the identification publicly. Stephen Shawn Austin became the first person identified as part of Project 525. His case also represented the 32nd case solved in Mississippi using Othram's technology. The announcement was professional, factual, focused on the scientific achievement. But behind those facts was a human story, a teenage boy who deserved better than to die far from home and lie nameless in the ground. If alive today, Stephen would have been 45 years old. He could have had a career, a family of his own, a lifetime of experiences. Instead, his life was cut short when he was just 17, barely begun. Now comes the hardest part of any true crime case, trying to understand what happened when so much remains unknown. The Mississippi John Doe's death is currently under investigation by the Mississippi Bureau of Investigation and the El Paso Police Department. Because it's an open investigation, many details haven't been made public. We don't know the cause of death. We don't know exactly where or when the remains were found. We don't know if there are suspects or persons of interest. But we can examine what we do know and explore possible theories about what happened. This is the theory that Detective Asaman proposed back in 2014, and it remains plausible. Stephen was on probation. He just had his first meeting with his probation officer on August 18, 1997. The next day, he disappeared. Perhaps the pressure of the juvenile justice system felt overwhelming.
Perhaps he couldn't face the restrictions, the check-ins, the loss of freedom. So he ran. Maybe he had money saved. Not much, but enough for a bus ticket or food for a few days. Maybe he planned to hitchhike, relying on the kindness or at least the tolerance of strangers to get him away from El Paso. The question is, why Mississippi? If Stephen was running away, where was he running to? Did he know someone in Mississippi? Did he have family there, friends? Or was Mississippi just where he ended up after a series of random rides and decisions? Let's consider that unconfirmed 1999 sighting by the cousin. If that was real, it means Stephen was alive for at least 2 years after disappearing. Where was he during that time? Was he moving around, staying with different people, trying to survive on the streets? Young runaways are vulnerable. They're targets for predators, people who offer food, shelter, money, drugs, anything to create dependency and control. They're vulnerable to trafficking, to exploitation, to violence. If Stephen ran away and made it to Mississippi, he could have encountered someone dangerous, someone who hurt him, someone who killed him. But this theory has problems. First, getting from El Paso to Mississippi without money, resources, or adult help is extremely difficult. It's over 1,300 miles. That's not a journey a 17-year-old makes easily, especially one with health problems like asthma and heart issues who needed medication. Second, if Stephen was trying to run away and start a new life, why would he go to Mississippi? It's not a major city with opportunities for someone trying to disappear. It's not California or New York or even Dallas or Houston. Mississippi is rural, economically struggling in many areas, not an obvious destination for a Texas teenager. Third, the timing. If the remains were in Madison County long enough to be skeletal by 2018, and Stephen disappeared in 1997, that suggests he died not long after disappearing, possibly within weeks or months. That's not a lot of time to travel from Texas to Mississippi, especially by hitchhiking or using public transportation. What if Stephen didn't leave voluntarily? What if he was taken? On August 19, 1997, Stephen left his house. Whether in the morning or late at night, we don't know. What if someone was waiting for him? Or what if he encountered someone who saw an opportunity? A 17-year-old boy, alone, perhaps trusting because he knew the person or because he was young and didn't realize the danger. A car pulls up. An invitation to get in. And then... This theory suggests either A, someone from El Paso with connections to or reason to be in Mississippi abducted Stephen and transported him there, or B, Stephen was abducted in El Paso and somehow ended up with someone who took him to Mississippi, or C, Stephen was murdered in El Paso and his body was transported to Mississippi to hide the crime. Option C is particularly disturbing, but must be considered. Moving a body across state lines is complicated and risky, but it's not unprecedented. It puts distance between the crime and the crime scene. It can confuse jurisdiction and make investigation more difficult. It can delay identification of the victim. But it requires resources, a vehicle, knowledge of remote areas in Mississippi, the ability to transport a body without being seen. This suggests planning, not a crime of opportunity. Who would have both the motive to kill Stephen and the means to transport his body to Mississippi? Stephen was on probation, which means he'd been in trouble with the law. We don't know for what, but it suggests he may have been involved in activities that brought him into contact with dangerous people. In 1997, El Paso was, and still is, a border city. It sits directly across from Ciudad Juarez, and the border between them is porous. Drug trafficking, human trafficking, and other criminal enterprises operate in the shadows of this border region. What if Stephen became involved with or witnessed something related to criminal activity? What if he saw something he shouldn't have? What if he owed money to the wrong people? What if he was used as a courier or a runner and something went wrong? This could explain both his disappearance and why his body ended up far from El Paso. Criminal organizations have networks that span states. They have the resources and the ruthlessness to eliminate problems and dispose of evidence in ways that make investigation difficult. But this is speculation. There's no evidence in the public record that Stephen was involved in serious criminal activity. Being on juvenile probation could mean anything from shoplifting to assault to drug possession. It doesn't necessarily indicate connections to organized crime. This is a theory that's difficult to consider but cannot be dismissed. In the late 1990s, human trafficking wasn't discussed as openly as it is today, but it existed. Young people, particularly runaways, particularly those from vulnerable backgrounds, were and are targeted by traffickers who exploit them for labor or sex. Interstate highways are corridors for trafficking. Interstate 10 runs from El Paso all the way to Florida, passing through Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama. Interstate 20 runs from Texas through Mississippi. If Stephen encountered a trafficker, someone who promised him a job, a place to stay, a way out of El Paso, he could have been transported to Mississippi. Once there, if he tried to escape, if he became a problem, if he threatened to go to police, the outcome could be deadly. This theory would explain how a 17-year-old from El Paso ended up in Mississippi. It would explain the distance from home. It would explain why he was never found alive, never called home, never tried to contact his mother.
But again, we don't have evidence of this. It's a possibility based on patterns we know exist, not on specific facts about Stephen's case. Statistically, when someone is murdered, it's most often by someone they know. Family members, friends, acquaintances, people who have proximity and opportunity. Did Stephen have a conflict with someone in his life, a fight that escalated, a relationship that turned violent? Did someone he trusted turn out to be dangerous? The cousin who reportedly saw Stephen in 1999, could he know more than he said? Was he involved somehow? Or was his statement genuine, but investigators haven't been able to confirm it? What about other family members, friends, people in the neighborhood, someone from school? And here's where it gets complicated. If someone Stephen knew was involved, how does Mississippi fit in? Did this person have connections there? Family there? Or was it chosen randomly as a place to dispose of evidence? Between the 1970s and early 2000s, several serial killers operated along interstate highways, particularly in the South and Southwest. They targeted hitchhikers, runaways, and other vulnerable people whose disappearances might not be immediately investigated. Could Stephen have fallen victim to such a killer? If he was hitchhiking from El Paso toward the East Coast, he would have been on routes that serial killers used. But most serial killers have patterns, types of victims they target, methods they use. If Stephen was a victim of a serial killer, there should be other similar cases, young black men disappearing from Texas and turning up dead in Mississippi. So far, no such pattern has been publicly identified in connection with Stephen's case. Regardless of which theory might be closest to the truth, certain questions demand answers. How did Stephen get from El Paso to Mississippi? Voluntarily or by force? Quickly or over time? When did he die? Shortly after disappearing or months, years later? How did he die? The cause of death hasn't been released. Was it homicide, or could it have been accident or illness? If homicide, what was the method? Where exactly were the remains found? The location could tell us a lot about what happened. Was the 1999 sighting real?
Did Stephen's cousin actually see him 2 years after his disappearance, or was that a mistake? Did Stephen know his killer, or was this a random act of violence? Why Mississippi? Of all the places Stephen could have ended up, why there? According to the public statement from Othram, Stephen's death is under investigation. Both the Mississippi Bureau of Investigation and the El Paso Police Department are working on the case. They likely have information that hasn't been released to the public: cause of death, condition of remains, evidence found with the body, specific location of discovery. They're likely trying to trace Stephen's movements from El Paso to Mississippi. They're likely re-interviewing people from 1997, looking at old case files with new eyes, trying to find connections they missed before. The identification of Stephen after 27 years is a huge break in the case, but it's not the end, it's a new beginning for the investigation. As of late 2024, Stephen Austin's case is classified as an active death investigation. The El Paso Police Department and the Mississippi Bureau of Investigation are working to determine the circumstances of his death and, if possible, identify who is responsible. Tips can be provided anonymously. Any information, no matter how small it might seem, could be the piece that finally solves this puzzle. Maybe you lived in El Paso in 1997 and remember seeing Stephen. Maybe you gave a hitchhiker a ride from Texas toward Mississippi that summer. Maybe you heard someone talking about something that didn't make sense at the time, but makes terrible sense now. Maybe you know someone who had connections to both El Paso and Mississippi, someone who was acting strangely in late 1997. Please, if you know anything, come forward. Stephen Austin's case is part of a larger crisis. According to the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, there are over 600,000 people reported missing in the United States each year. While most are found quickly, thousands remain missing for months, years, or decades. And in medical examiners' offices across the country, there are approximately 4,400 unidentified human remains, people who died and were never identified, who are waiting for someone to give them their names back. Young men of color are overrepresented in these statistics. They go missing, and their cases don't get the media attention, the resources, the urgency that cases involving white women and children receive. They become numbers instead of names, case files instead of people. Stephen Austin spent 27 years as a number, UP 13268. It took advanced DNA technology, a special initiative, and the generosity of a philanthropist to give him his name back. How many other Stephen Austins are out there still waiting? Stephen was the first person identified through Project 525, but he won't be the last. As of early 2025, Othram is working on hundreds of cases, using forensic genetic genealogy to solve mysteries that traditional methods couldn't crack. This technology is revolutionary, but it's expensive, and it requires public support. The Project 255 fund relies on donations to pay for the lab work, the genealogical research, and the time needed to identify these unidentified juveniles. If this case has moved you, consider supporting Project 525 or similar initiatives. Every dollar helps bring someone home, helps give a family answers, and helps ensure that victims aren't forgotten. Let's end where we began, with Stephen as a person, not just as a case. Stephen Shawn Austin was born on September 22, 1970. He lived for 17 years, which sounds short, but think about how much living happens in 17 years. First steps, first words, first days of school, learning to read, to ride a bike, to tie shoes, making friends, getting in trouble, figuring out who you are and who you want to be. Stephen was tall, 6'1" at just 17, still probably growing. He had health challenges he managed. He wore a gold earring that meant something to him. He had a mother who loved him enough to file a missing persons report and keep his case active for 27 years. He was a person. He mattered. His life had value. He deserved to live past 17. He deserved to grow up, to make mistakes and learn from them, to find love, to build a life, to grow old. He deserved better than to die young and lie unidentified in the ground for decades. Now he has his name back. Now his mother knows after 27 years of wondering that her son is dead. That answer is painful, but it's better than the torture of not knowing. And now maybe investigators can find out what happened. Maybe someone will come forward. Maybe the person or people responsible will face justice. Or maybe this mystery will remain partially unsolved. Another case where we have some answers, but not all. Where we know the ending, but not the middle. Either way, Stephen Austin is no longer invisible. He is no longer a number. He is remembered. He is mourned. He matters. If you take nothing else from this story, take this. The missing matter, the unidentified matter. Every case number represents a person who was loved, who had hopes and dreams, who deserved better than they got. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, advanced technology, dedicated investigators, and people who refuse to give up can bring them home. Stephen Shawn Austin is home now, not the way his mother hoped, but home nonetheless. May he rest in peace. And may justice, somehow, be done.